Tom's world shattered the moment he saw his daughter for the first time. She was perfect, tiny, soft, and beautiful, but something was off. Her skin was nothing like his or Sarah's. A single thought struck him like a blow: she's not mine. And as the realization sank in, so did the silence, thick and suffocating. Stay tuned to witness how this encounter takes a powerful turn you won't want to miss. Like this video and share it with others. And don't forget to subscribe and click on the notification bell for more impactful stories. It was a crisp spring morning when Sarah Bennett felt the first pangs of labor. Her husband Tom had been rushing around their modest suburban home, gathering the hospital bag and double-checking everything like an over-prepared scout leader. They'd been anticipating this day for months, dreaming of what their baby might look like. Sarah would joke about hoping the baby inherited her nose, while Tom would insist the little one needed his dimples. They were young, happy, and the kind of couple that people envied, a picture-perfect match, with matching blonde hair and blue eyes that seemed to shimmer under any light. The delivery room was bright and sterile, filled with the occasional beep of monitors and soft encouragement from the nurses. Tom stayed close, holding Sarah's hand, whispering words of comfort as she labored for hours. It was all worth it, every moment, when the baby finally arrived. A newborn cry filled the room, a sound that brought a mix of relief and overwhelming joy. The nurses congratulated Sarah and Tom, placing the baby gently into Sarah's arms. But the moment Sarah looked down at her child, a quiet chill passed over her body, so faint it could have been exhaustion. She blinked, stared, and then looked again. The baby's skin was soft, beautiful, and unmistakably darker than hers. Tom leaned in eagerly, grinning like a fool as tears pricked his eyes. "She's perfect," he whispered, brushing a finger over the baby's tiny hand. But then he paused. The grin faltered slightly, his brows drawing together. He looked again. His lips parted as though he meant to say something, but the words were stuck somewhere deep in his chest. He stepped back, his heart beginning to pound. The room shifted. Or maybe it was just him. Tom felt the weight of the air pressing in as he watched the nurse gently clean the baby and wrap her in a soft blanket. He blinked rapidly, swallowing the sudden dryness in his throat, while Sarah stared straight ahead, holding her newborn with stiff arms. Neither of them said a word, though both felt the question crawl up their spines. Tom's mind raced in dizzying loops, thoughts colliding, unraveling, and reforming as the world tilted. When they wheeled Sarah to a private room, Tom stayed close but distant, hovering like a ghost. The baby lay peacefully in her bassinet, her tiny chest rising and falling with steady breaths. Tom sat in a stiff chair by the window, staring at the baby and then out at the parking lot below. A storm of thoughts raged in his head, but one truth loomed larger than the rest: this doesn't make sense. The nurse came in with paperwork, asking questions about the baby's name. Sarah, still pale, offered a quiet Emma. Tom nodded absently. Emma. He liked the name, had always liked it, but the syllables felt heavy in his mouth now. He couldn't stop staring at his daughter's delicate features, her wide, curious brown eyes and the faint curl of her black hair. She was beautiful, perfect even, but Tom felt something breaking inside him. That night, when Sarah finally drifted into an exhausted sleep, Tom sat alone in the quiet hospital room, his hands shaking. His breaths were shallow as his eyes stayed fixed on the bassinet. Every time he tried to push the thought away, it returned with brutal clarity. He rubbed his face with both hands, trying to will away the rising pressure in his chest. At first, he had been telling himself it was a trick of lighting, a trick of tired eyes. But it wasn't. He knew it. And as the realization hit him fully, so sharp it was almost physical, he felt the tears well up. They slid down his cheeks silently, unstoppable, as his shoulders began to shake. The realization wasn't just that the baby didn't look like him. It was what it meant. Tom buried his face in his hands and cried, soft at first and then harder, his sobs muffled against his palms. The walls of the hospital room seemed to close in as the truth gnawed at him. For the first time in his life, Tom had no idea what to do. Tom sat in the darkness of the hospital room, the only sound the faint hum of machines and the rhythmic breathing of his wife and newborn daughter. He wiped his face with the back of his sleeve, trying to pull himself together, but the tears kept coming in bursts he couldn't control. Each sob felt like a dam breaking, releasing something deeper: fear, confusion, shame. He didn't know where it was coming from, only that it wouldn't stop. When he finally looked up, the baby was still there in the bassinet, wrapped snugly in her soft white blanket. Her tiny chest rose and fell in perfect rhythm, her face peaceful in the glow of the dimmed room light. She was innocent, utterly, completely innocent. And yet, her very presence was unraveling everything Tom thought he knew about his life. He turned to Sarah, still asleep in the hospital bed, her face pale and turned to the side. He didn't understand how she could sleep so soundly, how she hadn't yet broken like he had. Maybe she was holding it all in. Maybe she'd known something he hadn't. That thought sent another chill through Tom's body. Had she known? Guilt stabbed at him as soon as the thought formed. No. This was Sarah. His Sarah. The woman he'd loved since they were both 19, when she'd tripped over her shoelace in the college library and he'd caught her. They'd built their lives together, a life filled with trust, love, and certainty. Their wedding day had been perfect. Their house was modest but warm, and this baby, their baby, was supposed to be the crowning joy of it all. Tom clung to those memories like a drowning man clutching a life raft, but they weren't enough to quiet his mind. How could this happen? The hours passed slowly. Tom didn't sleep. He watched as the dark sky outside the window turned to soft gray and then to pale gold. Morning had arrived, but he felt no relief. He kept hearing the same phrase over and over in his head, as though someone were whispering it into his ear. This doesn't make sense. Sarah stirred. Tom watched her eyes flutter open, and for a moment she looked peaceful, content, even, as though nothing had changed. She turned her head toward the bassinet and smiled faintly, her voice hoarse when she whispered, "Good morning, baby girl." Tom's stomach twisted. He looked away, staring at his hands, which were clasped tightly together in his lap. "Tom." Sarah's voice broke the silence. He glanced at her but couldn't hold her gaze. "Yeah. You okay?" "I'm fine," Tom said too quickly, the lie almost choking him as it left his mouth. Sarah frowned slightly, sitting up with a wince. She looked toward the bassinet again, her smile faltering. "She's beautiful, isn't she?" Tom swallowed hard. "Yeah." Sarah's gaze lingered on him. She didn't say anything at first, just watched him carefully. "You didn't sleep, did you?" "No." Sarah reached out a hand, and Tom hesitated before taking it. Her grip was weak but warm, familiar. "What's wrong?" she asked softly. Tom opened his mouth but couldn't find the words. He wanted to say everything and nothing all at once. He wanted to tell her what he was thinking, that the baby wasn't his, that something was horribly wrong, but the words lodged in his throat like shards of glass. How could he say that out loud? How could he accuse his wife, even silently, of something so unthinkable? "I don't know," he said finally. It was the closest thing to the truth he could manage. Later that morning, a nurse came in to check on Sarah and the baby. She was bright and cheerful, with a practiced smile that didn't quite meet her eyes. "How's everyone feeling this morning?" she asked. "Better," Sarah replied, her voice stronger now. She cradled the baby in her arms, rocking her gently. "She's perfect." The nurse leaned over to coo at the baby, brushing a fingertip against the soft blanket. "She is a beauty. Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Bennett. You must be so proud." Tom flinched slightly, the word proud cutting deeper than he expected. He muttered a quick thank you and busied himself by pretending to check his phone. When the nurse left, Sarah turned to him again. "Tom, what's going on? You've been quiet all morning." Tom felt his chest tighten. He wanted to tell her. He needed to tell her. But every time he tried to form the words, the thought of her reaction stopped him cold. Would she laugh at him? Would she cry? Would she get angry? He couldn't bear to see hurt in her eyes, not after everything they'd been through. "I'm just tired," he said finally. "That's all." Sarah didn't look convinced, but she didn't push him. "Maybe you should go home for a bit," she said gently. "Shower, eat something. Get some rest. We'll be okay here." Tom hesitated. The thought of leaving the hospital filled him with guilt, but he also knew he couldn't keep sitting in that room, drowning in his thoughts. "Yeah, maybe you're right." The drive home was a blur. Tom didn't even remember pulling into the driveway until he saw their small white house in front of him, the lawn slightly overgrown from neglect over the past few weeks. He sat in the car for a long time, staring at the house and gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. When he finally stepped inside, the house felt empty and strange, like he was walking into someone else's life. The living room was exactly how they'd left it. Sarah's slippers by the couch, the baby swing assembled in the corner, a stack of unopened mail on the kitchen counter. The air was still and quiet. Tom sank onto the couch, dropping his head into his hands. The tears started again, slower this time, quieter. He thought about Emma, about Sarah, about how everything that felt so certain only yesterday was now slipping through his fingers like sand. He couldn't deny it anymore. The baby wasn't his. There was no other explanation. And yet, even as the thought solidified in his mind, another voice whispered in his ear. "What if you're wrong?" Tom sat there for hours, the weight of the realization pressing down on him like a stone. When his phone buzzed with a message from Sarah, "We're ready to come home," he knew he had no choice but to go back. When Tom returned to the hospital, Sarah was already dressed, sitting in a wheelchair with Emma in her arms. Her face lit up when she saw him, her smile so soft and loving that it nearly broke him all over again. "Ready to go home?" she asked. Tom forced himself to smile, nodding as he took the car seat from a nearby nurse. "Yeah, let's go home." As he helped Sarah into the car and strapped Emma into her seat, Tom felt like he was watching someone else go through the motions. He kept glancing at the baby, at her smooth brown skin, her dark curls, and his stomach twisted. The drive home was silent, the tension in the car so thick it was almost unbearable. Sarah didn't seem to notice, humming softly as she stroked Emma's tiny hand. When they pulled into the driveway, Sarah turned to him. "Tom, are you sure you're okay?" Tom gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. "Yeah," he whispered, though it was a lie. Because as he looked at his wife and their daughter, his perfect, beautiful daughter, he felt like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, unsure if he was about to fall or jump. Here's the continuation of the story, where the emotional weight deepens, and Tom's internal conflict begins to push toward a breaking point. When they got home, the house felt heavier than before. Tom carried the car seat into the living room and set it down carefully, his movements slow and deliberate. Sarah followed, moving gingerly, her exhaustion clear. She smiled softly as she leaned against the couch, watching Emma sleep soundly in the car seat. "She's so calm," Sarah whispered, her voice full of awe. "I thought newborns were supposed to scream all the time." Tom forced a weak smile. "Maybe we got lucky." Lucky. The word rang hollow in his mouth. He watched as Sarah bent down and carefully lifted Emma, cradling her to her chest as she swayed gently back and forth. Her face lit up with pure love, and for a moment, Tom couldn't breathe. How could everything seem so normal to her? How could she look at the baby and not see what he saw? Sarah looked up at him, her brow furrowing slightly. "Tom, are you sure you're okay? You've been acting strange." Tom swallowed hard, shoving his hands into his pockets to keep them from trembling. "I'm fine. Just tired, that's all." "You should sleep," Sarah said softly. "I'll take care of her for now." Tom nodded, though he knew sleep wouldn't come. He climbed the stairs to their bedroom, each step feeling like a lead weight. The room was dim, the soft light of the afternoon filtering through the curtains. Tom sank onto the edge of the bed, burying his face in his hands. His mind wouldn't stop racing. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Emma, tiny, perfect, and unmistakably different. There was no denying it, no convincing himself otherwise. The baby wasn't his. The thought burrowed deeper, like a splinter under his skin. But worse than that was the question that followed, clawing its way into his mind until he could think of nothing else. Had Sarah known? The thought made his stomach churn. He trusted Sarah. He always had. They'd built their entire marriage on trust, honesty, and the quiet kind of love that doesn't need words to be felt. But now, doubt gnawed at him, whispering things he didn't want to hear. How could she not notice? How could she look at Emma and not wonder? Tom stood abruptly, pacing the room. His chest was tight, his thoughts like a storm he couldn't quiet. He glanced at the dresser, where a framed wedding photo sat. In it, he and Sarah were smiling at each other, their faces full of hope. He picked up the photo, staring at it, as if the couple in the picture might have answers for him. But they didn't. Downstairs, Sarah was humming softly as she rocked Emma in her arms. She felt a peace she hadn't known in months, a kind of joy she thought only existed in stories. Emma's tiny hand curled against her chest, and Sarah felt her heart swell. She hadn't known it was possible to love someone this much, to feel so complete in a single moment. But something about Tom worried her. He hadn't been himself since the baby was born. He was distant, quiet in a way that felt wrong. She knew he was tired, they both were, but this was different. He wouldn't look at her for long, wouldn't smile like he used to. Sarah kissed the top of Emma's head, inhaling her soft baby scent. "Your daddy's just tired," she whispered, as much to herself as to her daughter. "He'll be okay." The words sounded convincing enough in the quiet of the room, but deep down, Sarah felt a flicker of unease. Tom didn't come back downstairs until dinner. He felt raw and hollow, like he'd spent the last few hours unraveling thread by thread. He found Sarah in the kitchen, holding Emma in one arm while she stirred a pot of soup with the other. She looked up when he walked in, smiling faintly. "Hey, did you get some rest?" Tom nodded, though it wasn't true. "Yeah, a little." Sarah studied him for a moment, her eyes soft. "I know this is a big change," she said gently. "It's overwhelming for me too, Tom. But we're going to be okay. I promise." Tom forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I know." Sarah handed him a bowl of soup and sat across from him at the kitchen table, Emma asleep in the bassinet beside them. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the fridge and the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Tom ate mechanically, not tasting the food. Sarah talked about small things, how nice the nurses had been, how they needed to order more diapers, how Emma smiled in her sleep. Tom nodded and murmured responses, but his mind was elsewhere. He watched the baby out of the corner of his eye, the way her tiny fingers twitched as she dreamed. She looked so peaceful, so innocent, and yet she represented everything that had started to feel wrong in his life. Finally, Sarah reached across the table and touched his hand. "Tom," she said softly, "please talk to me." Tom flinched at her touch, though he didn't mean to. He looked up at her, his throat tight. "What do you mean?" "You've barely said a word since she was born," Sarah replied, her voice trembling slightly. "You're here, but you're not here. I know something's wrong. Please tell me what it is." Tom opened his mouth, but the words wouldn't come. He wanted to tell her, wanted to scream it, but the thought of saying it out loud terrified him. What if it broke her? What if he was wrong? "I'm fine," he said instead, pulling his hand back. "Just tired." Sarah stared at him, searching his face for something he wouldn't give her. After a moment, she sighed and looked down at her soup. "Okay," she said quietly. "But I'm here when you're ready to talk." Tom didn't answer. That night, Tom couldn't sleep. He lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling as Sarah slept beside him. Emma's faint breaths came from the bassinet in the corner of the room, a soft and steady rhythm that only seemed to amplify the chaos in Tom's mind. He turned his head slightly, looking at the baby in the darkness. Her tiny form was still, peaceful in sleep. For a moment, Tom felt a flicker of something he couldn't name. Love, maybe. Or guilt. He sat up carefully, his movements quiet. He stood and walked to the bassinet, staring down at Emma. In the dim light, her features were softer but no less clear. Her smooth brown skin, her dark curls, her little fists curled near her face. Tom swallowed hard, his chest aching. "Who are you?" he whispered to the darkness. The baby didn't answer. She just breathed, steady and calm. Tom turned and walked out of the room, leaving the door slightly ajar. He padded downstairs, feeling like a stranger in his own home. In the living room, he sank onto the couch and buried his face in his hands. He sat there for hours, the silence pressing in on him, until the first light of morning crept through the windows. He knew he couldn't keep this up. The questions, the doubt, the guilt, they were eating him alive. Something had to give. And deep down, Tom knew what he had to do next. Tom sat on the couch as dawn crept through the windows, staining the walls with soft gold. The house was quiet, except for the faint ticking of the clock and the distant hum of morning birds outside. He rubbed his hands over his face, feeling the sting of exhaustion in his eyes. His chest ached with the weight of everything he'd been holding in. This couldn't go on. He knew that now. Footsteps creaked on the stairs, pulling him from his thoughts. He looked up as Sarah appeared in her robe, her hair tousled and her face lined with sleep. She stopped when she saw him sitting there, his shoulders slumped and his face pale. "Tom," she asked softly, "what are you doing down here?" Tom couldn't look at her. He stared at the floor, his hands clasped tightly between his knees. "I couldn't sleep." Sarah walked over and sat beside him, her presence warm and steady, but Tom didn't move. She studied him for a moment before speaking. "You need to tell me what's going on," she said gently. "This isn't just tiredness. Something's wrong, and I don't know how to help you if you don't tell me." Tom opened his mouth, then shut it again. He wanted to say it, wanted to tell her everything, but the words sat like stones on his tongue. Finally, he forced himself to look at her. Her blue eyes were filled with concern, soft and unwavering. "Sarah," his voice cracked, and he looked away again. "I don't know how to say this." "Just say it," she said, though her voice trembled slightly. Tom swallowed hard. He felt like he was stepping off the edge of a cliff. "It's about Emma," he said finally. Sarah's brow furrowed, and for a moment she looked confused. "Emma? What about her?" Tom hesitated, his chest tightening. She doesn't look like me, Sarah." The room felt colder suddenly, the air thick with something heavy and unspoken. Sarah blinked, staring at him as though she hadn't heard him right. "What?" Tom stood abruptly, pacing across the room like he was trying to outrun his own words. "I mean it, Sarah. She doesn't look like either of us. Her skin, her hair. I can't stop thinking about it. I don't understand how this happened." Sarah stared at him, her mouth slightly open as her face drained of color. "Are you serious right now?" Tom stopped pacing and turned to her, his hands shaking. "Look at her, Sarah. Just look at her. You don't see it? You don't see how different she is?" Sarah stood up slowly, her expression a mixture of disbelief and something sharper. "Tom, she's a baby. Our baby. What are you even saying right now?" Tom ran a hand through his hair, his breathing uneven. "I'm saying, I don't think she's mine." The words hung in the air like a bomb that had just gone off. Sarah flinched, as though he'd struck her. Her eyes widened, and for a moment she was speechless. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and shaking. "How can you say that?" "Because it's true," Tom burst out, his voice breaking. "I don't know how, I don't know why, but she doesn't look like me, Sarah. And he stopped, his throat closing. "I just don't know how this happened." Sarah's hands trembled as she brought them to her chest. "You think I cheated on you?" Her voice cracked, raw with hurt. "You think I did something so horrible that she's not yours?" Tom winced, guilt cutting through him like a blade. "I don't want to think that. But what else could it be, Sarah? What else explains it?" Sarah's face crumpled. Tears welled in her eyes as she stared at him, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I can't believe you're saying this. After everything. After all these years." Tom's chest ached as he watched her. He hated himself for saying it, for hurting her like this, but the doubt had consumed him. "I need answers, Sarah. I can't keep living like this." Sarah's tears spilled over, and she turned her back to him, wrapping her arms around herself as though trying to hold herself together. "You're wrong," she whispered. "You're so wrong. And you don't even see it." "Then tell me how I'm wrong," Tom said, his voice hoarse. "Tell me something that makes sense." Sarah didn't answer. She just stood there, her shoulders shaking. After a long silence, she turned back to him, her face streaked with tears. "I don't know what to say to you right now. I don't know if I can even look at you." She walked past him, her steps slow and unsteady, and disappeared up the stairs. Tom stood alone in the living room, the sound of her muffled sobs echoing faintly through the house. He sank onto the couch, dropping his head into his hands. His chest felt hollow, like something inside him had broken beyond repair. He hadn't wanted to hurt Sarah, but now that the words were out, he couldn't take them back. And worse, he couldn't silence the voice in his head that still whispered, "What if you're right?" Tom spent the rest of the day in a fog. Sarah stayed upstairs with Emma, the door to the nursery closed tight. The house felt like a stranger's home, quiet, cold, and filled with an ache he couldn't escape. By the time the sun set, Tom couldn't take it anymore. He needed answers, and there was only one way to get them. He pulled out his phone and searched for a nearby clinic. His hands trembled as he typed the words, "paternity test." It felt like betrayal, even as he did it. But he couldn't stop himself. The doubt had become unbearable, a weight he couldn't carry any longer. He booked an appointment for the next day and set the phone down, staring at the screen as his heart pounded. From upstairs, he heard a faint cry, the soft, broken sound of Emma waking up. Tom closed his eyes, guilt washing over him like a wave. He loved Sarah. He loved his daughter. Didn't he? But until he had answers, until he knew the truth, he couldn't shake the storm raging inside him. The following morning, Tom sat in his car outside the clinic, gripping the steering wheel tightly. He stared at the building, his heart hammering in his chest. The sun was bright, and the world outside seemed so normal, so unaware of the turmoil inside him. He glanced at his phone, reading the message he'd sent Sarah that morning. "I have to go out for a bit. I'll be back soon." She hadn't responded. Taking a deep breath, Tom opened the car door and stepped outside. His shoes crunched against the gravel as he approached the entrance, every step feeling heavier than the last. He didn't know what he was hoping for. Maybe confirmation that he was wrong, that Emma was his, and all of this had been a terrible mistake. Maybe he wanted proof to justify the doubt that had been eating at him. Either way, he knew there was no turning back now. Inside the clinic, a receptionist greeted him with a polite smile. "How can I help you today?" Tom swallowed hard. I need a paternity test." The receptionist nodded, sliding a clipboard toward him. "Fill this out, and we'll get you started." Tom took the clipboard with shaking hands and sank into a chair. As he began to write his name, he couldn't help but think of Sarah and Emma, the family he might lose forever, depending on what the test said. Tom filled out the paperwork with stiff, careful handwriting. His name. His address. Basic information that should have been simple but felt loaded now, each letter digging him deeper into something he wasn't sure he could escape. His hand shook when he reached the line that asked, "Relationship to the child." He hesitated, staring at the words until they blurred together. He finally wrote "father" and exhaled shakily, feeling like a liar. Once he handed the clipboard back, a nurse led him into a small, sterile room with white walls and laminated instructions taped to the cabinets. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic, sharp and unforgiving. Tom sat on the edge of a chair, his knees bouncing as the nurse explained the process. Quick, painless swabs that would provide answers. Answers he wasn't sure he wanted anymore. "Once we get the samples, you'll hear back from us in a few days," the nurse said kindly, as if that could make this any easier. Tom nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He leaned back as the nurse handed him a cotton swab and gestured for him to open his mouth. The entire process took less than 5 minutes, and when it was over, Tom felt empty, as though the test had taken something from him he couldn't get back. "Do you have the child's sample yet?" the nurse asked, scanning the paperwork. Tom froze. "No," he admitted. "Not yet." The nurse gave him an understanding look. "You'll need to bring it in for us to complete the test. Once we have both samples, we can move forward." Tom nodded again, barely hearing her as he left the clinic. The sun outside felt too bright, like it didn't belong in a world where everything felt so dark. He climbed into his car and sat there for a long time, staring at the steering wheel, his mind an echo chamber of guilt and doubt. How was he going to get Emma's sample? He couldn't imagine asking Sarah. Not now, not after what he'd said. He could barely look her in the eyes. She'd see right through him, and the thought of her knowing what he was doing made his stomach churn. But he couldn't stop. He needed the truth, even if it destroyed him. That night, Tom tried to act normal. He sat at the dinner table with Sarah, forcing himself to eat the pasta she'd made, even though he could barely taste it. Across the table, Sarah was quiet. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and her movements were slower than usual, as though the weight of the past 2 days had drained her of energy. "Did you have a good day?" she asked finally, though her voice lacked its usual warmth. "Yeah," Tom lied, his gaze fixed on his plate. "It was fine." "Where did you go?" Tom's heart skipped a beat. "Just errands," he said quickly. "Needed some air." Sarah stared at him for a moment, and Tom felt her eyes drilling into him, searching for cracks. She finally looked away, nodding faintly. "Okay." Emma's soft coos broke the silence, and Sarah stood to lift her from the bassinet in the corner. "She's been fussy today," she murmured as she cradled the baby. Tom looked up at them, at Sarah, her blonde hair falling gently over her shoulder as she smiled faintly down at Emma, and at the baby, her brown skin glowing softly in the warm kitchen light. The sight made his chest ache, a complicated mixture of love, guilt, and fear twisting inside him. "Do you want to hold her?" Sarah asked suddenly, looking up at him. Tom froze. "What?" "Hold her," Sarah said again, her voice quieter now, almost pleading. "You haven't held her since we got home." Tom's stomach dropped. He hadn't even realized it, but she was right. He'd been avoiding it, avoiding her. The thought of holding Emma made his throat close, as though the simple act would shatter the fragile barrier he'd built between himself and the truth. I don't know," Tom said awkwardly, staring at his hands. Sarah's face crumpled, her lip trembling as she held Emma closer. "You think she's not yours," she said softly, her voice breaking. "You really think that?" Tom couldn't answer. "How could you?" she whispered, her eyes brimming with tears. "How could you look at her and not love her? She's ours, Tom." "Us?" Tom pushed his chair back abruptly, the legs scraping against the floor. "I can't do this right now," he muttered, his voice hoarse. He left the table and walked out of the room, leaving Sarah standing there with Emma in her arms. As he climbed the stairs, guilt clawed at him, but the doubt was louder. He didn't know how to be the man she wanted him to be, not when his mind refused to quiet. The next morning, Tom woke up early. He slipped out of bed before Sarah woke, padding downstairs where Emma slept in the bassinet. She was quiet, her tiny chest rising and falling with soft, steady breaths. Tom stared at her for a long moment. She looked so peaceful, so innocent. He didn't know why it was so hard for him to see her and feel what he was supposed to feel, what he wanted to feel. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though he didn't know if the words were for her or for himself. He pulled a small Ziploc bag from his pocket, his hands trembling as he crouched beside the bassinet. He carefully picked up one of the baby's pacifiers, holding it between his fingers like it might break. It was so small, so light. He slipped it into the bag and sealed it, staring at it as though it held all the answers he'd been searching for. Tom stood up, his heart hammering in his chest. He tucked the bag into his jacket pocket and turned toward the door, slipping out quietly before Sarah woke. At the clinic later that day, Tom handed the pacifier over to the nurse, his hands clammy and his face pale. "This is the sample?" she asked gently. Tom nodded, unable to speak. "Okay," she said, her voice kind but professional. "We'll run the test and contact you as soon as we have the results. It usually takes about a week." A week. Tom felt the word echo through him as he left the clinic and climbed into his car. A week to find out the truth. A week to figure out whether his world would hold together or fall apart completely. As he drove home, his mind felt blank, like it had shut down under the weight of everything. He didn't know what to hope for anymore. When he pulled into the driveway, Sarah was waiting for him at the front door, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her face was pale, and her eyes were sharp, accusing. "Where were you?" she demanded as he stepped out of the car. Tom froze, his heart sinking. "Just out." "Don't lie to me," Sarah snapped, her voice trembling with anger. "You've been hiding something. I want to know what's going on, Tom. Right now." Tom stared at her, the weight of the past few days pressing down on him like a stone. He knew this was the moment. He couldn't keep lying, couldn't keep hiding what he'd done. He opened his mouth, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I had a paternity test done." The color drained from Sarah's face, her eyes going wide. For a long moment, she just stared at him, as though she couldn't believe what she'd heard. "You did what?" Tom couldn't look at her. "I needed to know," he said quietly. "I needed to be sure." Sarah's hands shook as she took a step back, her face twisted with shock and hurt. "How could you do this?" she whispered. "How could you, after everything?" Tom felt like he was sinking, like the ground had fallen out from under him. "Sarah, Get out," she said suddenly, her voice shaking. "Get out of this house." Tom's heart stopped. "Sarah, please." "Get out!" she shouted, tears streaming down her face. Tom hesitated for just a moment before turning and walking back to his car, the door slamming behind him. As he sat in the driver's seat, staring at the house that had been his home, he felt the full weight of what he'd done. And for the first time, he wondered if the answers he was searching for were worth the cost. Tom sat in his car, the engine off, staring blankly at the house he had just been thrown out of. The home he had built with Sarah. The place where they had laughed, cried, planned their lives, and dreamed about their future as parents. Now, the windows seemed cold, the house like a fortress that no longer welcomed him. Sarah's words echoed in his head, sharp as knives. "Get out of this house." The guilt weighed on him like lead, but he couldn't shake the other voice, the one that had led him here. "You needed answers," it whispered over and over, like a cruel justification. But now, sitting alone in the car with nowhere to go, Tom wasn't sure anymore. He rubbed his hands over his face, his breath shaky and uneven. How had it come to this? A few days ago, they had been happy. Nervous about becoming parents, sure, but happy. He hadn't expected Emma's arrival to throw him into a spiral he couldn't control. And now he'd lost Sarah, lost the home he thought was safe, because of the doubt he couldn't let go. He turned the car on, unsure of where to go but unable to sit there any longer. He drove without a destination, the town passing in a blur of muted colors. He ended up in the parking lot of a nearby park, empty and quiet at this time of the day. He sat there for a long time, watching the trees sway in the breeze, the silence gnawing at him. It wasn't long before his phone buzzed. He grabbed it quickly, hoping it was Sarah. Instead, the screen flashed a name he didn't expect, David Bennett. His father. Tom hesitated before answering. "Hey, Dad." "Tom, what's going on?" His father's deep voice rumbled through the phone. "Sarah just called me. She's crying her eyes out." Tom flinched, his stomach twisting. "She called you. She's worried sick. She said you did something about a test." Tom let out a breath and leaned his head against the steering wheel. "Yeah," he muttered. "I got a paternity test." Silence. For a long moment, all Tom could hear was the faint hum of the line. "Jesus, Tom," his father said finally, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Why would you do something like that?" Tom clenched his jaw. "Because Emma doesn't look like me, Dad. Or Sarah. I couldn't make sense of it. I needed to know." "And you think this is the way to go about it?" his father asked sharply. "By tearing your family apart?" Tom felt anger rise in his chest. What was I supposed to do? Pretend everything was fine when it wasn't? "Maybe you could have trusted your wife," his father shot back. "Did that ever occur to you?" Tom's shoulders sagged. "I tried," he whispered. "But I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't shake it." His father sighed, the sound heavy and long. "Listen, Tom," he said, his tone softer now. "When you were born, your mother and I, well, we didn't know what we were doing. There were plenty of sleepless nights, plenty of arguments. Being a parent changes you, son. It makes you doubt everything you thought you knew about yourself. But at the end of the day, you've got to hold on to what's real. And what's real is that you have a wife and a baby who need you." Tom swallowed hard, the weight of his father's words pressing into his chest. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted quietly. "Start by apologizing," his father said simply. "And pray that it's not too late." Tom didn't go home that night. He found a cheap motel on the edge of town and checked into a room that smelled faintly of mildew and old carpet. The bed was hard, and the sheets were scratchy, but none of it mattered. He lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. He thought about Sarah, about the look on her face when he admitted what he'd done. The hurt in her eyes haunted him, replaying over and over like a movie he couldn't turn off. He thought about Emma, too. Tiny, innocent Emma, who hadn't done anything to deserve this. For the first time, Tom let himself ask the question he'd been avoiding since the test. What if the results prove me wrong? The thought made his chest ache. If Emma was his, then he had destroyed everything over nothing. He'd doubted his wife, doubted his daughter, and shattered the trust that held their family together. And if she wasn't his, well, he didn't know what he would do then. The truth was, either answer scared him. The next morning, Tom sat in his car outside their house. He hadn't slept, and the dark circles under his eyes made him look older, worn down. He saw the curtains shift in the front window and knew Sarah had spotted him. Moments later, the front door opened, and Sarah stepped out onto the porch. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, and she looked tired, more tired than he had ever seen her. Her hair was pulled into a messy bun, and her face was pale, her expression unreadable. Tom climbed out of the car, his hands shoved into his pockets as he walked toward her. He stopped a few feet away, suddenly unsure of what to say. Sarah broke the silence first. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was cold, but Tom could hear the pain beneath it. "I came to talk," Tom said quietly. "Please, Sarah. Just let me explain." Sarah shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "Explain." "You did a paternity test, Tom. You didn't come to me. You didn't trust me. How do you explain that?" Tom looked down, guilt burning in his chest. "I was scared," he admitted, his voice trembling. "I saw Emma, and I didn't understand. I couldn't stop thinking about it, and I let it eat away at me. I was wrong, Sarah. I know I was wrong." Sarah's lip trembled, and she wiped angrily at her tears. "You broke us, Tom. You broke me. I don't know if I can ever forgive you for this." Tom felt like his heart was being crushed. "I know," he said softly, "and I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I'm begging you to let me make this right." Sarah stared at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. Finally, she let out a shaky breath. "The results," she said. "When do you get them?" Tom's throat tightened. "In a few days." Sarah nodded faintly, wrapping her arms around herself again. "I don't want you here until then. I can't look at you right now." Tom swallowed hard and nodded. "Okay." He turned back toward his car, his footsteps slow and heavy. Before he climbed in, he looked back at her one last time. She was still standing on the porch, her face streaked with tears, cradling herself as though she was trying to keep from falling apart. Tom climbed into the car and drove away, feeling the weight of what he'd done pressing down on him. He had torn his family apart, and now all he could do was wait for the truth to come, and for the world to decide whether or not he could put the pieces back together. The days that followed felt like a punishment. Tom moved through them in a haze, each hour stretching on endlessly. The motel room had become his prison, a box of peeling wallpaper and dim lights where the walls felt closer each day. He barely ate. He barely slept. Instead, he sat on the edge of the bed, staring at his phone, waiting for the call from the clinic that would tell him the truth. At night, the silence was unbearable. He thought about Sarah, about her tears, her voice breaking as she told him he'd broken them. He thought about Emma, too, and how her peaceful face had kept him awake night after night. She didn't deserve this. None of them did. Guilt gnawed at him constantly, twisting in his stomach like a sickness. The weight of what he'd done was suffocating. He thought of all the little moments Sarah had given him over the years, her trust, her laughter, the way she'd looked at him when she told him she was pregnant. He had betrayed all of it. And for what? A doubt that felt bigger than him. Tom wasn't sure anymore if the truth would save him or destroy him. He wasn't sure if he deserved saving. It was on the third day that the call finally came. Tom was sitting in his car in the parking lot of the motel when his phone buzzed on the passenger seat. He froze, staring at the screen, at the unfamiliar number that flashed across it. His heartbeat thundered in his chest as he reached for the phone, his hand trembling so badly he almost dropped it. He swallowed hard, then answered. "Hello." "Hi, Mr. Bennett." The voice on the other end was polite, clinical. "This is Emily from the clinic. I'm calling with the results of the paternity test you requested." Tom felt like the world had stopped spinning. The sound of traffic on the nearby road, the chirp of birds, all of it faded into a dull hum. "Okay," he croaked, his voice hoarse. There was a pause. "Would you like me to read the results to you now?" "Yes," Tom whispered. "Please." The line went quiet for a beat, and then Emily spoke. "The results indicate that you are the biological father of the child in question. The probability of paternity is 99.99%. Tom blinked. "What?" "You are the child's father," Emily repeated gently. "Is there anything else I can help you with today?" Tom couldn't answer. He ended the call without another word, the phone slipping from his hand and landing on the seat with a soft thud. He sat there, frozen, as the words repeated in his mind over and over again. "You are the father." The weight he'd been carrying for days, weeks, really, suddenly changed. It didn't lift. Instead, it pressed down harder, shifting from fear to guilt so sharp it nearly cut him in half. Emma was his. She'd always been his. And he had destroyed his family over nothing. Tom leaned forward, resting his forehead against the steering wheel as his chest heaved with sobs. All the shame, all the regret that he had tried to bury came spilling out of him in waves. He thought of Sarah, her face pale with disbelief as he accused her of something unthinkable. He thought of Emma, tiny and innocent, with no understanding of the damage he had caused. What had he done? Tom didn't drive home right away. He couldn't. He sat in the car for hours, trying to find the words for Sarah, trying to figure out how to face her after what he'd done. He knew that when he walked through that door, he couldn't undo the damage. There would be no magic words that could erase the hurt he had caused. By evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Tom finally started the car. The drive home felt impossibly long, every mile weighed down with dread. When he pulled into the driveway, he sat there for a moment, staring at the warm light spilling through the living room window. He could see Sarah's silhouette moving inside, and his chest tightened. Slowly, he climbed out of the car, his legs heavy as he approached the front door. He knocked softly, the sound barely audible, and waited. It took a moment before Sarah opened the door. When she saw him standing there, her face hardened, though the hurt still lingered in her eyes. "What are you doing here?" Tom swallowed, his voice low and trembling. "Can I come in?" Sarah hesitated, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She stared at him for a long moment, then stepped aside wordlessly. Tom walked into the house, the familiar scent of home wrapping around him like a memory he no longer deserved. Emma was in her bassinet, fast asleep, her tiny hands curled near her face. Tom's eyes lingered on her, his heart aching as he realized just how much he had let his fear blind him. Sarah shut the door and turned to face him, her expression guarded. "What do you want, Tom?" Tom met her gaze, his voice cracking as he spoke. "I got the results." Sarah's face paled slightly, but she didn't say anything. Tom took a shaky breath. "She's mine, Sarah. Emma's mine. She always was." Sarah stared at him, her eyes wide, but there was no relief in her expression, only more hurt. "You needed a test to tell you that," she said softly, her voice shaking. Tom flinched, shame burning through him. "I don't know what's wrong with me," he admitted. "I was scared. I saw her, and I let the doubt take over. I let it ruin everything." Sarah shook her head, tears filling her eyes. "You didn't just doubt her, Tom. You doubted me. You thought I betrayed you. How do you come back from that?" Tom wiped at his face, tears slipping down his cheeks. "I don't know," he said hoarsely. "But I'm going to try. I'll do anything, Sarah. I'll spend the rest of my life making this right, if you let me." Sarah looked at him for a long time, the tears falling silently down her face. Finally, she walked past him and stood over Emma's bassinet, looking down at their daughter. "You missed so much," she whispered. "All these days, you missed her." Tom turned to look at them, the sight of Sarah and Emma together breaking him all over again. "I know," he choked out. "And I'll never forgive myself for that." Sarah didn't answer. She reached down and gently picked Emma up, cradling her in her arms. The baby stirred slightly but didn't wake. Sarah looked at Tom then, her expression softer but still full of pain. "She's yours," Sarah said quietly, holding Emma a little closer. "But you have to decide if you're ready to be her father. Because she deserves better than this." Tom nodded, his tears falling freely now. "I know," he whispered. "I'm ready. I promise I'm ready." Sarah didn't say anything else. She turned and walked upstairs, leaving Tom standing alone in the quiet house. He sank onto the couch, burying his face in his hands as the weight of everything he'd done settled over him. It wouldn't be easy, he knew that. Trust wasn't something you could rebuild overnight. But as he sat there, listening to the faint sound of Sarah's footsteps above him, he made himself a promise. He would earn back what he'd lost. He would prove himself, to Sarah, to Emma, and to himself. No matter how long it took. Tom didn't sleep that night. He stayed on the couch, curled up in a position that felt as small and broken as he did. He listened to the sounds of the house, creaks of the wood, the faint hum of the refrigerator, and occasionally, the muffled cries of Emma upstairs. He thought about going up, but he didn't. He couldn't. Not yet. Morning came slowly. Pale light poured through the window, stretching shadows across the living room floor. Tom sat up stiffly, his muscles aching from the awkward position he'd slept in. He ran a hand through his unkempt hair and stared at nothing in particular. Upstairs, he heard Sarah's footsteps, and a moment later, the faint squeak of the nursery door opening. The sound of Emma's soft coos followed. Tom closed his eyes, the ache in his chest deepening. He had missed so much already. So many moments gone, he thought bitterly. He wanted to move. Wanted to get up and tell Sarah he was sorry again. Tell her he'd do anything to fix this, but he didn't know how. The door to the kitchen swung open behind him, and he turned to see Sarah standing there. Her expression was tired, her hair messy from another night of broken sleep. Emma was in her arms, tucked snugly against her shoulder. "You're still here," Sarah said softly, though her tone wasn't accusing. Tom nodded, his throat tight. "I didn't want to leave," he murmured. "I didn't know where else to go." Sarah stared at him for a long moment, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm making coffee," she said finally. "You can have some if you want." It wasn't much, but it was something. Tom nodded again. "Thanks." Sarah didn't say anything as she moved through the kitchen, setting Emma down gently in her swing by the window. The baby's wide, dark eyes opened, taking in the soft morning light. She stared quietly at her father, her little mouth forming an O shape as if she were studying him. Tom froze, his heart pounding in his chest. For the first time since he'd heard the test results, he let himself look at Emma, really look at her. She was beautiful. Her smooth, brown skin glowed in the light, and her dark curls framed her tiny face perfectly. He saw Sarah in her, in the curve of her mouth, in the softness of her expression. But as he stared at Emma, he saw something else, too, something he hadn't allowed himself to see before. Himself. It wasn't just the results that told him Emma was his. It was her. The little details he had ignored out of fear, the tiny dimple in her chin that mirrored his, the way her fingers curled when she slept, just like his mother had always said he did as a baby. Tom's chest ached as he crouched down beside the swing, staring at his daughter. Emma blinked at him, her gaze curious but calm, as though she already knew something he hadn't figured out until now. "Hey," he whispered, his voice breaking. "It's me." Emma let out a small coo, waving one of her hands aimlessly. Tom smiled faintly, tears blurring his vision. "You're mine," he said softly, more to himself than to her. "You're really mine." Sarah stood silently behind him, a mug of coffee in her hands, watching the scene unfold. Later that morning, Tom and Sarah sat at the kitchen table in silence. Emma was sleeping again, her tiny body swaddled in a blanket on the couch. The quiet between them felt fragile, like glass that might shatter with the wrong word. "I'm sorry," Tom said finally, his voice trembling. "For everything. I don't even know where to start, but I need you to know that." Sarah stared into her coffee, her face unreadable. "Do you know what it felt like?" she asked softly, not looking up. "When you told me you didn't think she was yours?" Tom flinched, shame burning through him. "I can't imagine," he whispered. Sarah finally looked at him, her eyes glassy but sharp. "It broke me, Tom. I carried that baby for 9 months. I felt her kick. I brought her into the world, and you thought I betrayed you." "I didn't want to," Tom said, his voice cracking. "I swear, Sarah, I didn't want to. I let the fear get to me, and I was wrong. I was so wrong." Sarah shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Do you have any idea how hard it is to come back from that? How hard it is to look at you and not hear those words over and over again?" Tom wiped at his face, tears sliding down his own cheeks now. "I know it won't be easy. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I love you, Sarah. I love Emma. I'll do whatever it takes to prove that to you." Sarah stared at him, silent for a long time. "You have a lot to prove," she said finally. "A lot." Tom nodded. "I know." The days that followed were quiet, tentative. Tom stayed in the house, careful not to overstep, careful to give Sarah the space she needed. He helped where he could, folding laundry, making dinner, watching Emma when Sarah needed a moment to herself. He didn't say much, but his actions spoke for him. When Emma cried, he was the first to pick her up, cradling her gently as he walked the length of the living room, humming softly until she calmed. He marveled at how small she was in his arms, how light she felt. He wondered how he had ever doubted her. At night, when Sarah would drift to sleep on the couch, exhausted, Tom would sit with Emma in the nursery. He'd rock her in the chair by the window, staring at her as she slept. "I'm sorry," he would whisper, over and over again. "I'm so sorry, baby girl." And somehow, when she slept in his arms, he felt like she could hear him, like she knew he was trying. One evening, a week later, Tom was feeding Emma on the couch while Sarah watched quietly from the kitchen. She leaned against the counter, sipping tea, her expression unreadable. "You're good with her," Sarah said finally, breaking the silence. Tom looked up, startled. "What?" "You're good with her," Sarah repeated, her voice softer this time. "She calms down when you hold her. She likes you." Tom looked down at Emma, her tiny hands resting against the bottle as she drank. "I didn't think I'd be," he admitted. "After everything." Sarah walked closer, standing at the edge of the couch. "I don't know if I'll ever forget what you did," she said quietly. "I don't know if I'll ever trust you the same way again." Tom nodded, his throat tight. "I understand." "But I see you trying," Sarah continued, her voice breaking slightly. "I see the way you look at her now. I think she sees it too." Tom looked up at her, hope flickering in his eyes. "I'm not going to stop trying, Sarah. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this." Sarah didn't say anything, but after a moment, she reached out and touched his shoulder. It was small, a brief gesture, but it felt like a crack in the wall between them. A sign that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. Tom looked back down at Emma, tears brimming in his eyes. He cradled her closer, her warmth seeping into his chest. For the first time in weeks, the storm in his mind began to quiet. They weren't whole yet, but they were still here. And for now, that was enough. The days turned into weeks. At first, the house was filled with a silence that neither Tom nor Sarah knew how to break. They moved around each other carefully, like strangers trying to avoid bumping into one another. Tom kept his promises quiet, folding clothes, taking out the trash, cooking meals. He didn't expect applause, and Sarah didn't give any. She let him try because that's all she could do. But Emma changed things. Every day, she grew a little more, learned something new. Her tiny giggles echoed through the house now, breaking the silence that had become unbearable. When Tom played with her, shaking a rattle or tickling her feet, Her laughter filled the room like sunlight pouring through a window. At first, Sarah watched quietly from a distance, unsure of what to feel. But there was something about the way Tom looked at Emma now that softened her. His hands, so big and clumsy compared to the baby's tiny form, were impossibly gentle as he cradled her. He studied her as though every feature, every sound she made, was something to be cherished. One afternoon, as Tom lay on the living room floor with Emma resting on his chest, Sarah stood in the doorway and watched. Emma's head was turned, her little cheek pressed against Tom's shirt as she slept, her soft breaths rising and falling in time with his. Tom's hand rested protectively against her back, his thumb stroking the fabric of her onesie. There was no hesitation, no doubt. It was the kind of scene Sarah had once imagined when she was pregnant, before everything had fallen apart. "I'm sorry," Tom whispered suddenly, his voice so low Sarah almost didn't hear it. He didn't look up. His eyes stayed on Emma, as though he was speaking directly to her. "I'm sorry I wasn't here for you at first. I was scared, and I let it control me. But I promise I'll never let you down again." Sarah felt her throat tighten. She blinked back tears and turned away before Tom could see her, retreating quietly into the kitchen. That night, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea while Tom cleaned up from dinner. The clink of dishes against the sink filled the quiet, along with the faint hum of the baby monitor resting on the table. Emma was upstairs, sleeping soundly. "You don't have to do that," Sarah said suddenly, breaking the silence. Tom paused, turning to look at her. "It's fine," he said quietly. "I don't mind." Sarah stared at the steam rising from her tea, her fingers tracing circles on the mug. "You've been doing a lot," she murmured. Tom dried his hands on a towel and leaned against the counter. "I'm trying," he said softly. Sarah looked up at him then, her blue eyes searching his face. "I see that." Tom held her gaze, his heart pounding. He hadn't expected to hear that. Not yet. "I'm not going to stop, Sarah. I mean it." Sarah nodded faintly, her expression unreadable. "I know." She hesitated, then looked down at her mug again. "It's going to take time, Tom. I don't know if I can ever fully forget what happened. But I'm trying to." Tom swallowed hard, relief and guilt flooding him at the same time. "That's all I can ask for." The sound of Emma stirring came through the baby monitor then, her soft cries breaking the moment. Tom straightened immediately, grabbing the towel and tossing it onto the counter. "I'll get her," he said, his voice gentle. Sarah watched as he disappeared up the stairs, and for the first time in weeks, she let herself feel the flicker of hope in her chest. Over time, the cracks in their relationship didn't disappear, but they became smaller. Tom continued to show up every day, not with grand gestures, but with small, steady acts of love. He woke up in the middle of the night when Emma cried, letting Sarah sleep. He bathed her after dinner, making her laugh with silly faces as she splashed the water. One Sunday morning, Tom was sitting on the couch with Emma propped up against his chest, holding a board book in front of her. He wasn't really reading. He was making up silly stories about the animals on the pages, and Emma stared at him wide-eyed, enraptured. Sarah stood in the hallway, unseen, watching them. She saw the way Tom looked at Emma now, with so much love and tenderness it nearly broke her heart. It was the look she'd wanted to see from the very beginning, before everything fell apart. Tom glanced up and noticed her standing there. He froze, embarrassed, as though she'd caught him doing something private. "Sorry," he mumbled, looking back at the book. "She likes the silly voices." Sarah smiled faintly. "Don't stop." Tom blinked, surprised, but then nodded and continued reading in a ridiculous high-pitched voice that made Emma squeal with laughter. Sarah turned away, her chest tight with emotion. Maybe trust couldn't be rebuilt all at once, but moments like this felt like stitches pulling the wound back together. Weeks turned into months. Slowly, the tension between Tom and Sarah eased. They began to laugh together again, even if it was only in short bursts. They talked more. Some nights, they stayed up late, sitting at the kitchen table while Emma slept, sharing stories about their day. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Tom and Sarah sat on the back porch, watching Emma play on a blanket spread out on the grass. She was trying to grab hold of a stuffed giraffe, her little hands waving in frustration every time it wobbled out of reach. "She's stubborn," Tom said with a smile, watching her. She gets that from you, Sarah replied, her voice soft. Tom glanced at her, surprised, and then chuckled. You're probably right. Sarah looked at him, her expression more serious now. You've changed, she said quietly. You're not the same man you were when this started. Tom swallowed hard, his smile fading. I had to change, he said softly. I almost lost everything. Sarah held his gaze for a long moment before looking back at Emma. I'm still angry, she admitted. Some days I look at you, and I remember how hurt I was. But I see you trying. And I see how much you love her. Tom nodded, his throat tight. I do. More than anything. Sarah took a deep breath and reached out, lacing her fingers through his. It was tentative, but it sent warmth spreading through Tom's chest. I don't know if we'll ever be exactly what we were before, she said. But I want to keep trying. For her. For us. Tom squeezed her hand, his eyes burning with tears he refused to let fall. Me too, he whispered. Me too. Emma let out a triumphant giggle then, having finally grabbed hold of the giraffe. She waved it in the air proudly, and both Tom and Sarah laughed, the sound carrying through the evening air. As the sun set, Tom looked at his family, his wife, his daughter, their tiny world pieced back together bit by bit. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that they were going to be okay. The seasons changed, marking time in a way that felt both slow and fast. Summer's golden days melted into the soft grays of fall. The air grew cooler, and soon the house was filled with the comforting smell of baking cookies and the hum of a space heater working overtime. Tom stood by the window one crisp Saturday morning, sipping a cup of coffee and watching leaves swirl across the lawn. Behind him, Emma babbled happily on her playmat, swatting at toys with the clumsy delight of a baby just discovering the world. The sound made him smile every time. Are you just going to stand there all day? Tom turned to see Sarah leaning in the doorway, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Her hair was pulled back loosely, and her sweater hung comfortably over her frame. She looked softer than she had in months, the tension in her face finally starting to fade. Tom smiled back, setting the coffee down on the table. Just admiring the view. Sarah raised an eyebrow, smirking. The leaves. Sure, Tom said with a chuckle. The leaves. She shook her head and crossed the room, kneeling down next to Emma and scooping her up into her arms. Emma squealed happily, clinging to her mother's hair with a giggle. Tom watched them, his chest tightening with gratitude. There was no grand, magical fix for what had happened between them. No single day or moment where everything had snapped back into place. Instead, it had been small, steady steps, quiet conversations late at night, shared laughter over spilled baby food, Tom's constant presence and quiet resolve to be better. Some days were still hard. Sarah had been honest about that. There were moments when doubt would creep into her voice or a silence would hang heavy between them. But it didn't linger as long as it once did. They were learning how to trust again, how to be a family again. Do you want to go for a walk later? Sarah asked, glancing at him as she adjusted Emma in her arms. Tom nodded. Yeah, I'd like that. Sarah smiled faintly, and Tom felt his heart lift. It wasn't the same smile she'd given him years ago when everything had been simple and easy. This one was different. Hard one, quieter, but real. That afternoon, they bundled up against the cool autumn air and walked to the park, pushing Emma in her stroller. The leaves crunched underfoot, and the late afternoon sun bathed everything in a soft, golden light. Emma stared up at the trees with wide eyes, cooing softly as Tom bent down to point out the different colors to her. Red, he said, holding up a maple leaf. See that, Emma? Red like your little hat. Sarah laughed softly beside him. She's a baby, Tom. I don't think she cares about the colors yet. Doesn't matter, Tom replied with a grin. She's learning early. He reached into the stroller and brushed a curl away from Emma's face, his smile softening as she grabbed his finger and held on tightly. In that tiny, simple moment, the ache that had lived in Tom's chest for months finally began to loosen. He glanced at Sarah, who was watching them with an expression he couldn't quite read. When their eyes met, she reached out and took his hand, threading her fingers through his. Tom squeezed her hand gently, gratitude swelling in his chest. "Thank you," he said softly. "For what?" Sarah asked. Tom looked at her, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "For giving me another chance." Sarah held his gaze, and after a moment, she nodded. "You earned it." The wind rustled the trees around them, sending leaves tumbling through the air like confetti. Emma let out a happy squeal, clapping her hands as a bright orange leaf floated into the stroller. Tom and Sarah laughed together, the sound easy and free in a way it hadn't been for a long time. That evening, back at home, Tom stood in Emma's nursery, watching her sleep. The room was warm and dim, lit only by the soft glow of a nightlight shaped like a star. Her tiny chest rose and fell rhythmically, her fingers curled near her face as though she were holding on to something in her dreams. Tom stepped closer and rested his hand gently on her back. "You're perfect," he whispered, his voice thick with love. "And I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you know that." He turned as Sarah appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame as she watched him. Her eyes were soft, her expression calm. "You're good with her," she said quietly. Tom smiled faintly, brushing a hand over his face. "She makes it easy." Sarah stepped into the room, wrapping her arms around herself as she stood beside him. "She's lucky to have you," she said after a moment. "And so am I." Tom turned to look at her, his heart swelling. "I'm lucky to have you, too." Sarah didn't answer, but she reached out and took his hand, holding it tightly as they both looked down at Emma. For a long time, they stood there together in the quiet of the nursery, the weight of the past finally starting to lift. The cracks in their family weren't gone, but they had begun to heal. And as Tom looked at his daughter, his beautiful, perfect daughter, he realized that sometimes broken things could be rebuilt. It just took time, love, and the willingness to keep trying. Outside, the wind whispered against the windows, carrying with it the promise of a new season. And for the first time in a long time, Tom believed that everything was going to be okay.